When I joined the hiking club, I thought it would be a good way to clear my head. After the breakup, I needed something to take my mind off everything, and a weekly hike seemed like the perfect distraction. The group was small, just 5 of us, and we'd meet every Saturday to explore the woods and trails around town. It was all normal, relaxing even, until the night they brought me to the altar. The hike started like any other. We met at the trailhead just before sunset, everyone bundled up against the chill of early fall. Jason, the group leader, was his usual cheerful self, cracking jokes as we loaded up our packs. Olivia and Mason were quieter, sticking close to each other like they always did. And then there was Claire. She was the one who had convinced me to join in the first place, flashing that easy smile of hers and saying, "It'll be fun, I promise." That evening she seemed different. Tense, distracted. When I asked if everything was okay, she just said, "You'll see." It felt like a warning. The trail was unfamiliar, winding deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone before. Jason kept reassuring us that he'd scouted the route earlier in the week, but something about it felt wrong. The trees were too tall, their twisted branches blocking out most of the moonlight. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. About an hour in, the trail disappeared. Jason said it was fine, that we'd just take a shortcut, but my unease was growing. We climbed over rocks and ducked under low-hanging branches, the undergrowth thick and unforgiving. By the time we reached the clearing, I was ready to turn back, but when I saw what was waiting for us, I froze. In the center of the clearing was a massive stone altar, weathered and covered in moss. Symbols were carved into its surface, jagged lines and spirals that hurt to look at like they didn't belong in this world. Around the altar were remnants of candles melted down to stubs and dark stains that looked too much like dried blood. I asked Jason what this was. He said, "It's tradition." The way his voice dropped when he said it made my stomach twist. I turned to Claire, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, she said, "Just trust us, okay? It's important." Before I could argue, Olivia and Mason pulled a bundle out of their pack. A heavy, cloth-wrapped object that clinked faintly as they carried it to the altar. Jason motioned for me to follow, and despite every instinct telling me to run, I stayed. When they unwrapped the bundle, I saw what was inside. Bones, human bones, arranged in neat rows like a macabre puzzle. A skull sat at the center, its empty sockets staring back at me. I said, "What the hell is this?" Jason said, "We need them for the offering." Claire put a hand on my arm, her grip tight. She said, "This is why we're here." I stepped back, shaking my head. I told them they were insane, that I was leaving, but Jason blocked my path. He said, "You're already part of this. You can't leave now." His tone was calm, almost kind, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. Olivia and Mason began arranging the bones on the altar, their movements precise and practiced. Jason lit the candles, the flames casting strange, flickering shadows across the clearing. Claire handed me a knife. Small, sharp, the handle wrapped in worn leather. She said, "It needs blood, just a little." I refused. I told her I wasn't doing this, that I wanted no part of it. She said, "You don't understand. If we don't do this, it will find us." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. Jason stepped closer, his expression hardening. He said, "It's not a choice. You're in this now, whether you like it or not." The others nodded, their faces grim. I realized then that they weren't scared of me leaving. They were scared of what would happen if I didn't stay. They started chanting, their voices low and rhythmic. The words were harsh, guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the smell of the forest was replaced by something metallic and foul. Jason grabbed my wrist and pressed the knife into my hand. He said, "Just a drop. That's all it takes." I tried to pull away, but he held firm. Claire said, "Please just do it. I don't want to die out here." Her words broke something in me. Against my better judgment, I pressed the blade to my palm, wincing as it sliced through the skin. A single drop of blood fell onto the altar, landing in the center of the skull. The chanting stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the ground began to shake. The altar glowed faintly, the carvings coming to life with a sickly green light. The bones rattled, shifting and rearranging themselves into something that wasn't human. It rose from the altar, towering over us, its form indistinct and ever-changing. I couldn't look directly at it. My eyes burned, my head pounding with a pain so intense I thought my skull would split. Jason and the others dropped to their knees, their faces contorted in expressions of terror and reverence. The thing spoke, its voice a deep, resonant growl that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It was hungry. Jason whispered, "It's done. We're safe now." But he was wrong. The creature reached for him first, its shadowy appendage wrapping around his body like a vice. He screamed as it dragged him toward the altar, his voice cutting off abruptly as he disappeared into the light. The others tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. I don't know how I escaped. The last thing I remember is Claire grabbing my arm, pulling me into the woods, her face streaked with tears. She said, "Don't stop running, just keep going." When I woke up, I was alone. The sun was rising, the forest quiet. There was no sign of the altar, the bones, or the others. I made it back to my car and drove home, but the memories still haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the chanting again, and when I close my eyes, I see the altar, waiting for the next offering. When people talk about things they regret, they usually mention relationships, jobs, or missed opportunities. For me, it's the night I tried to summon something I didn't understand. I was desperate, and desperation makes you do stupid things. It started when my younger brother Ben got sick. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. One day he was fine, the next he couldn't get out of bed. They ran every test, tried every treatment, but nothing worked. Watching him waste away was unbearable. I would have done anything to save him, and eventually I did. A few weeks after Ben got sick, I was scrolling through the forums I visited late at night, places where people shared stories about the strange and unexplained. One thread caught my eye, the rite of restoration. The post claimed it was an ancient ritual used to heal the sick or dying. It didn't require blood sacrifices or selling your soul, just a few specific items and absolute commitment. The instructions were clear: follow every step perfectly, or you'd regret it. At first I dismissed it as nonsense, but the more I thought about it, the more it nagged at me. What if it worked? What if it was the one thing that could help Ben? I read and reread the post until the words were burned into my mind. The next morning I started gathering what I needed. The ritual called for 7 items: a lock of hair from the person you wanted to save, a white candle, a black mirror, a bowl of water drawn at midnight, a piece of silver, a fresh sprig of rosemary, and a single drop of your own blood. Some of it was easy to find. The candle, the rosemary. The mirror was harder. It had to be polished obsidian, not just painted glass. I eventually found one at an antique store 2 towns over. The woman behind the counter gave me a strange look when I bought it, but I didn't care. The final step was the blood. The instructions said it had to be taken willingly, with a clean blade, and added to the bowl just before the ritual began. I hesitated when I read that part. I'd always been squeamish about blood, even my own. But for Ben, I told myself I could do it. I waited until midnight, just like the instructions said. The house was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I set up the ritual in my bedroom, locking the door to keep anyone from interrupting. The mirror went on the floor, with the bowl of water placed directly in front of it. The candle and rosemary sat on either side, the silver coin at the top. The lock of Ben's hair felt strange in my hand, like I was crossing some invisible line by even holding it. I placed it in the bowl, took a deep breath, and pricked my finger with a sewing needle. A single drop of blood fell into the water, rippling outward in perfect circles. I lit the candle, and the room filled with the smell of wax and rosemary. The final step was to speak the incantation. The words were strange, guttural, and I struggled to pronounce them. As I spoke, the air around me seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. The flame of the candle flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows on the walls. I kept going, my voice shaking, until the last word left my lips. At first, nothing happened. The room was silent, the air still. I stared into the mirror, expecting, I don't know what, a sign, a voice, something to tell me it had worked. But the mirror reflected only the candlelight in my pale, nervous face. I was about to blow out the candle and call it a failure when I saw the first ripple. It spread across the surface of the water, slow and deliberate, though nothing had touched it. I leaned closer, my breath hitching in my throat. That's when I saw it. A hand, pale and thin, rose from the water. It wasn't like a human hand. The fingers were too long, the joints too sharp. It moved with a strange grace, as if it were underwater even though the bowl was shallow. I tried to pull back, but my body wouldn't respond. The hand reached toward the mirror, its fingers pressing against the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the mirror began to crack. The sound was deafening, like glass shattering in slow motion. The cracks spread outward, forming a web of jagged lines, until the mirror was nothing but fragments held together by some unseen force. The hand slipped through the cracks, and I finally found the strength to move. I scrambled back, knocking over the candle and plunging the room into darkness. The next thing I remember is waking up on the floor. The candle was gone, the bowl was empty, and the mirror was intact. It was as if the ritual had never happened. I tried to tell myself it was a dream, hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But when I went to check on Ben the next morning, something was different. He was awake, sitting up in bed for the first time in weeks. He said he felt fine, better than he had in months. The doctors were baffled, calling it a spontaneous recovery. My parents cried with relief, and for a while I let myself believe that everything was okay. But then the nightmares started. Every night, I see the hand reaching through the cracks of the mirror, pulling itself closer. Sometimes I hear whispers, low and guttural, in a language I don't understand. The shadows in my room seem darker, longer, as if something is waiting just out of sight. I haven't told anyone what I did. I don't think they'd believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? I saved Ben's life, but I'm starting to think it came at a cost. The mirror is still in my closet. I've thought about throwing it away, smashing it to pieces, but part of me is afraid. Afraid that whatever I let through will find me, no matter where I go. Last night, I woke up to the sound of glass cracking. It was supposed to be a joke, just a stupid, harmless way to kill time. Looking back, I don't even know why I went along with it. Maybe I didn't want to seem like a buzzkill, or maybe part of me didn't believe it could actually work. Either way, I never should have followed Jamie into the woods that night. Jamie was the kind of guy who always had to be the center of attention. He'd heard about the ritual from some obscure forum online and decided it would be the perfect way to freak us out. He said it was called the Offering, some ancient ceremony people used to summon a spirit that would grant you whatever you wanted. Wealth, power, revenge, you name it. The catch was, you had to prove you were serious by giving up something that mattered to you. I told him it sounded ridiculous, but he just laughed and said, "That's the point. Come on, it'll be fun. We'll scare the hell out of everyone and have a great story to tell later." He managed to talk 6 of us into joining him. We were all crammed into his car, bouncing along a dirt road that cut through the woods on the edge of town. The night was cold and moonless. the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the headlights. Jamie was in high spirits, cracking jokes and making wild gestures as he explained the ritual. None of us took it seriously. At least not then. When we reached the clearing, Jamie jumped out and popped the trunk. He pulled out a backpack stuffed with supplies, candles, a piece of chalk, and an old metal bowl. He said the bowl was crucial, that it had to be made of iron for the ritual to work. He'd found it at a thrift store and spent hours scrubbing off the rust. We set up in the middle of the clearing, arranging the candles in a circle and drawing the symbols Jamie had printed out. The symbols were strange, jagged lines that twisted and intersected in ways that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. Jamie said they had to be perfect, that even one mistake could ruin everything. While he worked, the rest of us hung back, joking nervously and shoving our hands into our pockets to keep warm. There was a tension in the air, like we all knew we were about to cross some invisible line but couldn't bring ourselves to back out. Finally, Jamie stood up and clapped his hands together. "All right," he said, "let's get this show on the road." He handed each of us a piece of paper and told us to write down something we wanted. It didn't have to be serious, he said, just something to make it feel real. I hesitated, but everyone else was scribbling away, so I wrote the first thing that came to mind: a new car. My beat-up sedan had been on its last legs for months, and I figured it was as good a wish as any. When we were done, Jamie collected the papers and dropped them into the bowl. He poured something over them, a dark, viscous liquid that smelled like copper. "Blood," he said with a grin. "Relax, it's fake. Got it at a Halloween store." He set the bowl in the center of the circle and lit the candles. The flames flickered wildly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Jamie began to chant, his voice low and steady. The words were guttural and alien, like nothing I'd ever heard before. At first, nothing happened. We stood there, shivering and glancing at each other, wondering if this was it. Then the air changed. It grew colder, sharp and biting, like the heart of winter had descended on the clearing. The candle flames turned blue. Jamie's voice grew louder, more frantic, as if he were struggling to keep control. The shadows around us deepened, and I realized they weren't just shadows anymore. They were moving, curling inward like tendrils of smoke, reaching for the circle. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air was heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Jamie let out a strangled cry, and the bowl erupted into flames. The fire was blinding, pure white, and it burned without heat. When it died down, the clearing was silent. The candles had gone out, and the symbols on the ground were smudged, as if something had dragged its fingers through them. The bowl was empty, the papers and blood completely gone. Jamie was on his knees, staring at the ground. He said it worked. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept repeating, "It worked. It worked." The rest of us were too shaken to argue. We helped Jamie pack up the supplies and piled back into the car. The ride home was quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts. I told myself it was over, that it had been some elaborate prank, but deep down I knew better. The next morning I found a set of car keys on my kitchen counter. I didn't recognize them, but when I went outside, there was a brand new car parked in my driveway. It was exactly the model I'd written down to the color and trim. I called Jamie, but he didn't answer. I tried the others, but their phones went straight to voicemail. By the end of the day, I was panicking. I drove to Jamie's house, only to find his mom on the porch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She said he hadn't come home last night, that no one knew where he was. I haven't seen him since. None of us have. The others stopped returning my calls, and I don't blame them. Every time I drive the car, I feel like I'm being watched, like something is sitting in the back seat waiting. I should have walked away that night. I should have left when I had the chance. But now it's too late. I never planned to participate in the ritual. I didn't even know it was happening. My roommate, Evan, had always been a little eccentric, but I thought his quirks were harmless. He collected weird artifacts, old books, strange statues, things he found at flea markets or estate sales. Our apartment was like a museum of the bizarre. I didn't mind. It was his space as much as mine. Then he brought home the jar. It was small, no bigger than a mason jar, filled with what looked like ash and dirt. The lid was sealed with red wax, and there were strange symbols etched into the glass. Evan told me he found it at a garage sale on the outskirts of town. He said the old man who sold it to him warned that it wasn't meant to be opened. I rolled my eyes and told him it sounded like a scam. He laughed and said he didn't care. The story was worth the $20. For the first few days, the jar sat on the coffee table. I tried not to think about it, but I'd catch myself glancing at it whenever I walked past. There was something off about it, something I couldn't explain. The way the symbols seemed to shift when the light hit them, or the faint metallic smell that lingered in the air around it. One night, I came home late from work to find Evan sitting on the floor, the jar in front of him. The wax seal had been broken, and the lid was off. He was staring at the contents, a strange dark powder that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. I asked him what he was doing. He said, "It's not just ash. I think there's something alive in here." I told him he was being ridiculous and asked if he'd been drinking. He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, words I didn't understand. I asked him to repeat himself, but he just shook his head and told me to leave him alone. Over the next few days, things got worse. Evan stopped going to work. He barely ate, barely slept. Whenever I saw him, he was hunched over the jar, whispering to it like it could hear him. The apartment felt colder, darker, like the air itself was heavier. I tried to confront him, but he waved me off, saying you wouldn't understand. This is bigger than us. The breaking point came a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to a low humming sound, like a distant generator. When I went to check it out, I found Evan in the living room. He had drawn a massive circle on the floor with chalk, filled with symbols that looked like the ones on the jar. Candles lined the edges, their flames unnaturally still, casting long shadows on the walls. Evan was standing in the center of the circle, holding the jar above his head. He was chanting in that same strange language, his voice low and trembling. I shouted at him to stop, but he didn't even flinch. The humming grew louder, vibrating in my chest. The candles flared, and for a split second, the entire room was bathed in a blinding red light. When the light faded, Evan was on the floor, unconscious. The jar was shattered, its contents scattered across the circle. At first I thought it was over. I thought I'd stopped whatever he was trying to do, but then I saw it. The powder wasn't just powder, it was moving, writhing like it was alive, pulling itself together into something solid. I can't describe what it looked like. My mind refuses to hold on to the details. All I know is that it wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It wasn't anything that should exist. I grabbed Evan and dragged him out of the apartment. He woke up as we reached the stairs, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He kept saying, "It's here. It's here. It's here." We never went back. I told the landlord there had been a fire, that we lost everything. I don't know if he believed me, but he didn't press. Evan moved back in with his parents, and I crashed with a friend. I haven't spoken to him since. Sometimes I think about reaching out, but part of me is afraid he'll answer. Afraid he won't. The worst part is, I still hear the humming sometimes. Faint and distant, like it's calling me back. There was something.